10 seconds. 10 seconds is all it took for Flight 5022 to leave the runway, get into the air, and then crash down in one final shower of flames and destruction. The reason? It wasn't because of rough weather, and an engine didn't just suddenly blow out. Nor was it some freak lightning bolt sent down by Zeus himself to strike them down. No, this unimaginable disaster happened all because of complacency and a series of unfortunate events that border on irony. A short and simple delay took the pilots out of their comfort zone, and that simple change out of their normal routine caused their internal autopilot systems to go haywire. Forgetting to flip one simple switch was all it took to send an aircraft carrying 172 people on board hurling towards the ground. With just 10 seconds after takeoff, you'd think that they would have gained enough height for such a fall to be all that deadly, but you'd be dead wrong about that. Let's look into the final few seconds, a simple mistake and a minor glitch in an usually faultless system to see just how very disastrous 10 seconds can really be. This is the story about Flight 5022. You know how we do things here. We're going to take a little detour to take a look at the crew and the craft in question first. Starting with the captain, 39-year-old Antonio Garcia Luna, and his co-pilot, First Officer Francisco Javier Muley, who was 31 years old. Captain Luna was a very experienced pilot in many ways. Besides his 8,000 hours in the air, he'd also served in the Spanish Air Force, worked in the United States for a while as a flight instructor. He'd been employed by Spanair for 9 years at this point and was very well liked by his colleagues. There was a note made for his proficiency testing that all pilots must take every year to retain their licenses. That Luna needed to improve his coordination and communication skills. Don't get us wrong here. Luna was very much in perfectly proficient form to fly, and he'd actually passed that part of the exam. It's just that his scores, though still well above average, had declined a little since the year before. And quite frankly, most pilots get half a dozen notifications like this after every annual testing they go through, and they take the necessary training and extra practice needed to sharpen up to get back to optimal shape again. If anything, Luna was a bit obsessive about doing things by the book. Of that, every crew member that had worked with him before could testify. Luna was not the kind of man to make a mistake, especially a mistake as inconceivably commonplace as we'll discover in just a few minutes. And that's why he was tasked with Muley as his co-pilot. Muley only had 220 hours under his belt when he was first hired by Spanair. Since he'd been hired, however, he'd logged 1,200 hours on the MD-80 passenger plane and was well on his way to becoming a salted pilot in his own right. Still, it was deemed necessary to put a more senior pilot in charge to supervise him. Just because he had so little experience compared to the other pilots working for Spanair. There were no blemishes on his record, and all he needed was to do a little overtime to get those hours up, just like any other pilots would have to at that point in his career. Similarly, Muley was respected and well liked by his colleagues, with many comparing Muley's meticulous nature to the more serious Luna's respect for keeping things in order. The 15-year-old McDonnell Douglas MD-82 passenger plane had an equally clean record. Spanair had bought it off a Korean airliner in 1999, and it had been working smoothly in its entire 15 years. Besides a few run-of-the-mill repairs and regular maintenance checks, the plane was in perfect working order. The MD-82 was one of the most popular passenger planes in the world, practically dominating in the 90s in sales. They're known to be safe, spacious, and unproblematic to fly for the pilots. Since the 80s and 90s, their popularity dwindled in favor of newer models, but there has never been any question about their reliability before. Two really interesting features of the MD-82 series is that the engines are situated at the tail and the passengers board at the tail end, and not at the side of the aeroplane like other aircrafts. This is an especially useful feature for airports that don't have jet bridges. Now we move on to 2008. On August the 10th, Flight 5022 was scheduled to take off from Barcelona El Prat Airport at around 1400 that afternoon, make a quick stop in Madrid, and then head off for its final destination, Gran Canaria Airport in Spain. Even with the stopover in Madrid, the entire flight should have only taken 2 hours and 45 minutes to complete. It was about as routine as it gets. At 13:30, the plane was already lined up on the runway and ready to go. Besides the pilots and 4 other crew members, there were 166 passengers on board. Almost all of them were Spanish nationals, with only 15 of the other passengers being from other countries. Most of them were holiday goers, taking advantage of Spain's lovely warm summer weather. Among the 166 passengers, 22 of them were children. This time of year is important to the circumstances that are about to play out in just a few minutes. August in Spain and Greece falls in summer, and they are the hottest of all the European countries. This doesn't just translate to the perfect beach-going weather, but also the ideal conditions for flying. Skies are clear, storms are non-existent, and normally, cold temperatures of the northern hemisphere are not a concern for aircraft and the constant threat of sensors outside the plane icing over. And this was in the middle of the afternoon, the hottest time of day, making icing almost an impossible occurrence. Luna called in to flight control to release them onto the runway, and the tower got back to them in quick order, confirming that they were clear to take off. But Luna noticed a light blinking on the control panel to his right, just above the steering wheel. It was one of the RAM air temperature probes on the outside of the plane, recording excessive high temperatures, 104 degrees Celsius to be exact.
Madrid, Spanair 5022. Look, we've had a slight problem. We have to exit the runway again.
Now, the RAT probe is a very important feature in the event that temperatures are cold enough to cause freezing conditions that could ice over the sensors on the outside of the plane that sends information about their altitude, weather conditions, locations, and all sorts of necessary information that the pilots need to operate. The day was warm, but certainly not the boiling degrees that the RAT probe was picking up. Obviously, the probe was malfunctioning. Luna abandoned takeoff, parking the plane under the maintenance hangar. The technicians tested the RAT probe and determined that it was indeed overheating. They briefly considered cooling it with dry ice, but ultimately the decision was made to disable it instead. Even if cooling it with dry ice worked, there was always the chance that it would overheat all over again. And since the RAT probe's readings affected the amount of thrust that was automatically applied during takeoff, it was decided that the safest course of action would be just to remove it completely, leaving the pilots to take off manually. Technicians refilled the fuel for good measure while they were waiting for the RAT destabilization to commence. It wasn't absolutely necessary for them to do so, but since the plane had started its engines and then switched them off, no matter how little actual function the machine put out during those few minutes, it is procedure to top up the tanks with fuel every time an aircraft's engines turn off. The whole affair took them less than an hour to complete, so the passengers remained seated where they were and were assured by the captain that this was not an emergent issue. They'd be up in the air in no time. And Luna was right to assure them. The conditions that day, and the relatively short flight, would not be sufficiently cold enough to cause icing over the sensors. 5022 could have a new RAT probe fitted when the flight was completed. The only difference now would be that Luna and Moulet wouldn't need to keep the weather conditions in mind for this flight themselves without the assistance of the probe to do it for them, and takeoff would require that the pilots control the thrust manually. Both Luna and Moulet were trained and experienced with taking off manually, so they weren't overly concerned about this change of plan. Besides, every forecast and confirmation from other airplanes in the air brought back news that the skies were about as perfect as they could have asked for. Luna didn't know it at the time, but the RAT probe had been malfunctioning for days at this point. But every other pilot that had piloted 5022 had ignored it thus far, simply because it wasn't necessary, given the favorable weather conditions. And since the RAT probe reads both the external and internal temperatures, it has a habit of giving abnormally high readings during takeoff, when those engines are putting out a greater amount of thrust, and therefore heat during the airplane's rise. It could have been that the other pilots simply mistook these unusually high readings as just a result of taking off from the runway. And this is where the first problem comes into play. Luna and Mulay were both so used to the humdrum routine of getting an airplane off the runway in an orderly fashion that this simple turnaround interrupted their biological, habitual mode. Everything was not as it usually was. Even though it was such a simple and quick change from the usual, they were completely out of sorts when they were cleared for takeoff all over again. Since the plane's engine was off for nearly an hour, the air conditioning was off too, and this caused the interior to heat up fairly quickly on such a sunny day. The passengers and the crew were all a little sweaty and uncomfortable by the time the air conditioning came on again. And to make matters worse, when Luna drove the plane back to its takeoff position, the radio was turned to the wrong station, so he had to reconfigure it to get through to control to give them the all clear once again. So even though these little problems were very insignificant issues and the passengers were being incredibly patient with the delay, it did make everyone irritable, hurried, and it caused them to fumble over small problems. At 14:08, flight control gave Luna the green light, and they were finally ready to start their acceleration down the tarmac. At 14:12, Luna and Mulay began to go through their checklist of roughly 9 steps as they started the engines. Ignition, air conditioning, doors, cabin pressure, a cursory overview of the hydraulics and all the sensors, and lastly, they had to set the flaps and slats. Extending the flaps on the wings is done as the plane reaches the appropriate speed for takeoff. Essentially, it broadens the surface area of the wing, allowing air to push the wings up from below. It's a pivotal step to gaining the appropriate amount of speed and lift for takeoff. Without those flaps extended, the heavy aeroplane can't tilt its nose up high enough to achieve flight. Without them, 5022 just wouldn't have enough thrust to keep it in the air without that extra push from below, and therefore also not enough speed to keep it from quite literally wobbling in the air like a paper plane losing altitude. This is the crucial check that both of the pilots failed to do. But one minor inconvenience after the other, their usually pinpoint focus and Luna's natural inclination for order was disrupted, not to mention being rushed, since they were now delayed by a whole hour. Simply put, they were distracted and made a simple yet deadly oversight. Luna and Mulay were also expected to have a more manual role to play in getting the plane to take off and land. The engine's temperatures require more thrust, and therefore heat during takeoffs, and without the RAT probe, the internal workings of the craft wouldn't be aware of the kinds of temperatures that indicate whether the plane is rising, landing, or cruising, requiring Luna to keep an eye on the temperature, thrust, and tarmac ahead of him at the same time. At 14:23, Mulay released the brakes and the wheels started to move, with Luna steering them into position. In the final recordings, you can hear Luna conversing with control like every other day, going through the checklist as the plane's wheels picked up speed. Mulay reread the checklist, as is procedure, and even ending by saying, "Flap at 11. Even though the LCD screen should have read that their position was at 0, as we'll get into later, it's highly unlikely that this was another malfunction on the airplane's part. The multiple investigations after the crash indicated that everything was working as it should on their screens. What most likely happened, due to the rushed and frazzled state of the pilots, they experienced something that experts call expectation bias. That occurs when our human nature to expect something to be there without truly looking whether or not it is truly so, based solely on habit, causes us to overlook things. Mulay was already under pressure, and by extension, Captain Luna too, because his attention was directed at the runway on which he was steering the plane, so he just assumed that Mulay was correct without glancing at the control panel himself. Both Luna and Mulay fell victim to this very human mistake that regular people are guilty of making every day. At this point, when the engines fire up and the plane starts moving, there is a safety feature that should have told them that the flaps weren't engaged. The takeoff warning system, also known as TOWS or TOWS for short, should have been sending off an audible alarm. And in those final crucial seconds, when he should have released the flaps and the plane's nose began to turn up, no one at control noticed that he'd missed the final check either. And neither did TOWS, because TOWS did not have the temperature rise indication from the rat probe to notify it that the plane was getting ready for takeoff. Unfortunately, this is a highly debated point. TOWS should have been in effect the moment that the wheels started moving. There are many other indicators and information signals coming in that would have been telling TOWS that they were in the process of taking off. Just a lack of temperature information does not explain why this program did not take effect. But since no alarm can be heard on the communication recordings and the pilots did not react to it, it can only be assumed that TOWS was malfunctioning too, and probably had been since the first time the rat probe was starting to show issues. The two systems are internally linked to one another, and by removing one, it could have been the straw that broke the other's functionality. Did the pilots fail to complete the checklist fully? Absolutely. It's part of their training and should have been as automatic for them as turning the engine on. But it cannot be denied that his crucial failsafe warning would have changed the course of this devastating oversight completely. The checklist, the rat probe, the TOWS alarm, 3 separate systems all overlooked by both pilots just because the day started off out of sorts. Regardless of all these oversights, Flight 5022 went hurling down the tarmac, gaining speed appropriate for takeoff. Captain Luna can be heard conversing with Control and Mulay as they get ready for liftoff. The plane's nose begins to rise as the pilot pulls the yoke towards him, and then suddenly, chaos erupts on the radio.
Vaya motor.
Without the flaps engaged, the plane just couldn't generate enough lift to give it that final push it needed to smoothly and completely become airborne. Now the events that are about to go down all happened incredibly fast. We're talking about approximately 10 seconds where things happen so quickly that it's almost humanly impossible to keep track of it all. Just keep that in mind as we get into the rapid-fire succession with which everything plays out. 5022 lifted just 25 feet off the ground, and instantly, the stall warning and stick shaker activates. The stick shaker causes the yoke to vibrate violently in the pilot's hands. Without the necessary thrust that would have been given by the wing flaps, the entire body of the plane tilts to the right at a 32-degree angle, while the craft was still trying to climb. Luna immediately yanks the yoke to bring them back. Unfortunately, without that inertia achieved, with thrust and lift working together to keep the plane straight, the wobble effect that began to take place was instantly irreversible. Mulay screams that an engine must have blown out. This is an understandable conclusion since the plane pitched so suddenly to the right. It felt like the left engine had stopped dead and that the right side was tilting them. Mulay instinctively applied pressure to the thrust, hoping a burst of speed would straighten them out. Instead of steadying out, they pitched to the left due to Luna's overcompensating force on the yoke. In the course of this tick-tock motion, the plane manages to achieve an altitude of 40 feet before they lose the altitude they managed to gain. 5022 is heading straight for the ground now. They've weaved around so much in just 4 or 5 seconds that they no longer have the runway beneath them. Instead, they slam down, tail first, onto the ground, in the field right next to the tarmac. Somehow, between the screams of shock from the passengers and the utter confusion in the cockpit, the whole craft veers off to the right, leaving tire tracks in their wake. The moment they hit the floor, the right wing was torn off. The stump was left on the side where the wing used to be, probably caught fire. Going at 168 miles per hour, the plane, openly bleeding fuel from its severed wings, careened off into the field. They hit a small embankment, rose a few feet and crashed back down again, this time taking the landing gear and both engines off either side of the tail. A few feet further, they hit a dry riverbed head-on. The crash was sufficient enough to sever the tail and to collapse the cockpit back into the passenger compartment situated at the front, crumpling the metal with Luna, Malay and all the passengers seated toward the front. It's all but certain that they all died instantly. The openly leaking fuel ignited in this final crash, in what can only be described as a fireball explosion. From their rise to the end of their journey into the field, it took approximately 10 seconds before they reached a dry riverbank 656 feet away from the runway. They probably would have gone twice as far if it hadn't been for the bank they hit. Later, we would discover that Malay and Luna tried to fight the yoke to the last second, proven by the fact that both men had broken their arms. And those final few seconds were all caught on the airport's CCTV camera that just happened to be angled straight at the area where the black smoke was now rising from. Of the 172 people aboard 5022, only 18 survived. And of those 18 survivors, 3 of them were children. Paramedics employed by the airline and other staff members descended on the scene, but they were beaten back by the raging flames. It would be the firefighters who were able to finally penetrate the flames to get the living out. The bodies of the deceased were carried to an unused hangar on the airport's grounds, waiting to be identified. It took only a few days to clear the scene, remove every last scrap of rubble, and to identify every victim. Yet the subsequent investigation would not reflect the same efficiency as the rescue operation did. Not even close. Because this legal battle would rage on for 15 whole years, so why on earth would a seemingly human error cost so much time in court? Well, it's because the warning bells had been ringing since 1987, 21 years before 5022 crashed. McDonnell Douglas, who developed the MD-82 passenger aircraft, had actually realized that this fail-safe system was inefficient after the 1987 crash of Flight 255, when the TOWS program failed to sound the alarm in almost identical circumstances. Then another similar crash happened in 1989, and then they reported their concerns again. They urged airlines to require that pilots check the system before every takeoff, and not just at the start of every day. But this suggestion was never implemented by airlines, or later by Boeing, who brought the entire MD-82 line during a merger in 1997. For a third time, McDonnell Douglas warned them that the standard checklist was insufficient, and for a third time, they were ignored. To make matters worse, just 8 months before Flight 5022 crashed, Boeing reviewed their checklists and gave them the stamp of approval. The subsequent lawsuits proved that Boeing had been warned 3 times in the past, and that they had an opportunity to adjust the checklist a 4th time when the issue was brought up again during those reviews. The other half of the lawsuits resulted in years of mudslinging between Boeing, Spanair, and the state. After all this time, Spanair was bankrupted and ended up closing down, though for more reasons than just Flight 5022's tragic crash. But Spanair's many legal troubles are a subject for another day. Finally, the verdict was reached. This was pilot error. Due to their rushed and unfocused state, Luna and Malay simply forgot to extend the wing flaps, but Boeing needed to adjust their procedural checklists and sufficient training with it. Of that there is no doubt. There's evidence that Spanair was also aware of this, and that they were given an inexpensive repair that would allow them to not change their checklists or procedures at all. But they decided not to take the offer when it was presented to them. We can't elaborate too much on this lawsuit. However, since it's still ongoing, and like we said, Spanair's problems go far beyond just Flight 5022. The state's lawsuit against Spanair regarding Flight 5022 ended in March 2024, and all we know is that the families of the deceased received the maximum amount in their settlement. But what that amount is anyone's guess. because this entire ordeal was deemed more the pilot's error than the less than effective checklist and the unresponsive alarm that should have warned them one last time. In other words, the checklist and warnings weren't ideal, but the biggest share of the blame lies on the shoulders of the men who forgot to extend the flaps. The new checklists were made mandatory by Boeing just a few months after 5022's crash, alongside new sensors and more thorough warning programs. The MD-82s have been almost completely discontinued since then, and there hasn't been a crash of this nature since 2008. And finally, we need to look at Boeing's steady decline as the podium holder for the world's biggest and most trustworthy aerospace company, and also the reason that these lawsuits went on for so long, because this is going to come up a lot in future videos. Truth be told, in the 70s, a brand new company burst onto the scene called Airbus, and Boeing began a succession of mergers and buyouts with other, smaller companies in order to expand their empire. Their focus was mainly on expansion, and their sights set on competing with Airbus. Ever since the 70s, we see one crash after the other due to budget cuts, extremely tight deadlines on engineers and technicians to roll out aeroplanes out of the workshop as fast as they could, and shortcuts taken with upgraded procedures and training that had been put on the back burner longer than they should have in favor of other expansions. And every time an issue comes up, Boeing's lawyers have made it an art to drag things out in court. They've relied heavily on others' monetary limitations. And we hate to say it, this tactic has worked incredibly well for them so far. Very few of their lawsuits reach a jury, and most of them are settled out of court, dropped by the plaintiffs, or completely thrown out of court due to minor technicalities. The 70s marked the beginning of Boeing's decline, slowly gaining traction until the race reached its peak in 2019, when Airbus finally overtook the century-long magnate as the biggest producer of airplanes and the aerospace company with the highest annual revenue on the planet. And if the 40 or so lawsuits that are currently on Boeing's doorstep as of 2024 is anything to go by, well then, this company that once held the monopoly in aerospace's time is running out. Not to mention more whistleblowers coming out of the woodworks than we can even begin to count, each with horrifying accounts of deplorable in-office behavior and downright dangerous demands from their manufacturing floor that's caused the release of unsafe aircraft, leading to devastating results. And it's not just Airbus that's given them a run for their money. With the introduction of SpaceX, Boeing's contracts are becoming few and far in between as they are run off the tarmac by companies that produce better, more efficient machines that don't have a tarnished reputation to bring them down. Was Flight 5022's doom Boeing or Spanair's fault? Well, no. But it did tear open the dark underbelly of airlines and aerospace companies using long drawn-out court battles and payoffs to hide their inadequacies. The deaths of those 154 crew and passengers was tragic, yes. But if there's one silver lining to all of this, it's that the companies in charge will no longer be able to hide behind the skirts of their lawyers, nor will they simply be able to use money and threats to silence victims and employees. Prevention and quality must never come before pride and monetary income. And this whole drawn-out affair has put into serious question whether or not laws can be put in place to prevent this courtroom board game from going on and on and on. All we can do now is wait another few years to see if these deplorable tactics of hiding evidence and silencing witnesses will finally come to an end. The issue that caused 5022's crash have been laid to rest, but will the legalities surrounding it, and so many others that suffer the same fate, be put to bed as well?